Good Sunday morning. I'm Evan Donovan. News Channel 8 is your local election headquarters, and this is Politics on Your Side. This week, new indictments in the FBI probe hanging over Tallahassee's city government. City Commissioner and former Mayor Scott Maddox and Downtown Improvement Authority Executive Director Paige Carter Smith were both indicted in a sweeping 44-count indictment. The cloud of the investigation over his city hall and his possible involvement may have cost Mayor Andrew Gillum the election. He was not mentioned in the indictments. However, the investigation is still ongoing. This morning, Governor-elect Ron DeSantis is adding a new member to his team. DeSantis nominating Republican State Representative Danny Burgess to head the Department of Veterans Affairs. Burgess, who represents a district north of Tampa Bay, will have to step down to take this role in Tallahassee. DeSantis replaces Governor Rick Scott as the new governor on January 8th. President Trump announcing a new acting chief of staff this week to replace the outgoing John Kelly. It comes after another well-known political figure took his name out of the running. NBC's Kristen Welker has more.
The president filling Washington's biggest job opening, at least for now, tweeting that Mick Mulvaney will be the acting White House chief of staff, saying he's done an outstanding job while in the administration. Mulvaney is the current budget director and a former member of Congress with allies on both sides of the aisle.
Mick Mulvaney has done a fantastic job.
It caps what was a suspenseful and sometimes chaotic search, with questions if the president was having trouble filling the job, one of the most highly coveted in Washington.
Who is the president's frontrunner for chief of staff?
Oh, I'm not saying, although I know. I know the answer, I'm not telling you.
Just today, longtime ally and former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie dropping out of consideration, and talks fell apart with the presumed frontrunner Nick Ayers, who had the same role for Vice President Pence. But the president just last night insisting he had plenty of people on his short list.
5 people, really good ones. Terrific people, mostly well-known.
Current Chief of Staff John Kelly will leave at the end of the year, pictured with his predecessor, all smiles at a White House Christmas party last night. Kristen Welker, NBC News, the White House.
President Trump's former personal attorney and fixer, Michael Cohen, is heading to prison for 3 years. Now, the man who once claimed he'd take a bullet for the president is accusing him of ordering him to do his crimes. But the president continues to deny his involvement. Susan
Handed a 3-year prison sentence and millions in fines, President Trump's former lawyer and fixer Michael Cohen speaks out in an interview with ABC News.
You lied for him for a long time.
More than 10 years.
Why?
Out of loyalty.
Cohen sounding contrite and reformed, but pinning his actions squarely on the president.
Nothing at the Trump Organization was ever done unless it was run through Mr. Trump. He directed me.
Cohen says President Trump not only knew of hush money payments made to 2 women before the election, but ordered them with the clear intention of keeping voters from learning of his extramarital affairs.
To help him and the campaign.
Let me tell you, I never directed him to do anything wrong.
The president denies ordering the payments, and the White House questions Cohen's credibility.
He's a self-admitted liar. You guys all know that. And for him to say, I'm going to stop lying now, starting now, is somewhat silly.
Cohen says he's done lying, and it's time for the president to do the same.
I should not be the only one taking responsibility for his actions.
So he's still lying?
Yes.
Meanwhile, legal experts are watching for more developments from the April raid on Cohen's office.
If anybody hasn't already had sort of scandal fatigue, hold on tight, because here we go again.
As for Cohen,
I will not be the villain of his story.
Prison-bound and seeking not to be remembered as a pawn who did the president's criminal bidding. Susan McGinnis, NBC News, Washington.
The process to reunite children separated from their families at the U.S.-Mexico border is almost done. A district judge made that announcement on Friday. Reuniting more than 2,000 migrant children with their families has been a months-long process. From April through May, the Trump administration enforced a zero-tolerance policy that separated families at the border. President Trump signed an executive order in June to reverse the policy amid intense public pressure and backlash. The Department of Homeland Security is investigating a heartbreaking death in Texas. This is 7-year-old Jacqueline Call from Guatemala, who died while in the custody of U.S. border officials. As Jake Soboroff reports, her case raises questions about U.S. border policy.
Jacqueline Call and her father were among 163 migrants who crossed the border illegally. and were apprehended by the Border Patrol in New Mexico last Thursday. According to Customs and Border Protection, they were put on a bus to be transported to a Border Patrol station 95 miles away. But not long after, the father notified agents his daughter was vomiting. Jacqueline didn't receive medical attention until she arrived at the station 90 minutes later, but by then, she had stopped breathing. She was airlifted to a hospital in El Paso, where she died the next morning. Homeland Security says their inspector general is investigating the incident. When CBP's commissioner testified before Congress on Tuesday, he made no mention of Jacqueline's death, only saying their system is flawed.
Our Border Patrol stations and ports of entry were built to handle mostly male single adults in custody, not families or children.
Critics say the administration's crackdown will only lead to more death.
One of the Border Patrol chiefs told me that the drug smugglers are the ones who create the humanitarian crisis out here. It's not their enforcement policy.
If it wasn't for our border enforcement policies, the cartels would not even be involved in the human smuggling business, maybe to begin with.
For Jacqueline Call, a dangerous journey and deadly consequences. And tonight, questions unanswered. Jacob Soberov, NBC News, Los Angeles.
Coming up next, our panel of experts will join us to talk about the week's biggest headlines in Florida politics, including a new ban on plastic straws in St. Pete, controversial school safety recommendations, and a judge striking down the Affordable Care Act. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Joining us today to break down the political happenings of the week are two well-known names in Florida politics. Michelle Todd Schorsch is a public affairs consultant who has worked on multiple campaigns on both sides of the aisle. Barry Edwards is also a political consultant and a commentator on News Talk Florida. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having us.
So incoming Governor Ron DeSantis making several picks for his new administration. He announced he'll keep Rick Scott's budget chief Cynthia Kelly, Melinda Miguel as chief inspector general, and State Representative Danny Burgess, as you just heard, will head the Department of Veterans Affairs. He campaigned, as the president did, on draining the swamp. Any surprises here, and how would you grade the transition team so far?
Well, I think there's no surprises, but it shows you that people like Danny Burgess could have been a state senator following Tom Lee's retirement in 4 years, but it shows you that people expect the Republicans to dominate for the next decade, so they're going into government jobs.
Why do you say that? Because
he's leaving what he could have been on the track to be a state senator. Now he's on track to be an agency head and then move up into that realm, where he also makes a lot of money. But what I think is important here to show is that for DeSantis, for all the conversation about picking across the aisle, like with Jared Moskowitz for the the Florida basically FEMA position, is he came out this week against implementation of Amendment 4, and it shows that he's going to be a hard right governor.
Yeah, we'll get into that a little bit. Go ahead, Michelle. What do you think?
I think that the DeSantis administration has made some excellent picks so far. I think with the appointment of Shane Strom as his chief of staff, Shane is a veteran of 2 governors' administrations. He is well liked in the process and is really able to get stuff done. I think that he has actually shown that he is willing to reach out to people and appoint them in his administration who may not have supported him in the Republican primary. You know, appointing a Democrat to a position like that is no small feat for a Republican governor to do, and I actually think it is. His steps have been great so
and he
far.
certainly doesn't have to.
No, he doesn't have to. He doesn't
Right.
owe Democrats anything.
Sure. Well, let's talk about this for a second, actually, about Amendment 4. It was put into the Florida Constitution. We know that lawmakers have already had problems implementing what the voters want, as we've seen with the 71% of voters who voted for medical marijuana, which is still a major issue. Does this need implementation from the legislature? Why isn't it just, I was a felon, now it's in the Constitution that I can sign up to vote? Why can't I just go register to vote?
Well, the person who wrote it, John Mills, who's probably the best constitutional scholar in Florida, says it's self-implementing. The Republican leadership, DeSantis, Governor-elect DeSantis, he opposed it during the election cycle.
He certainly did, yeah.
And I think that they're afraid that everybody who is registered as ex-felons are going to vote as a Democrat, and that's not necessarily true. You only get a 3 or 4% yield, so I think they're overreacting, but I think that they're trying to find ways to slow walk it, and I think that's troubling.
Yeah. Sure.
I think that this has been Governor-elect DeSantis' only misstep so far. I think, you know, more people voted for Amendment 4 than voted for Governor-elect DeSantis, so I think he needs to stop standing in the way of implementing this. And the good news is we don't have any major elections coming up, so we do have the time to figure out how to implement this right away. We're not disenfranchising any voters at this moment.
Except in Tampa. We've got the mayoral election coming up in March.
Except for the Tampa mayoral election.
Right.
But we do have until March, so
Sure.
we do have a little bit of time to figure this out. So it doesn't have to be implemented today. But yes, we do have the mayoral election in Tampa, and we have some municipal races. But it's not like the decision has to be made this week.
Right.
We have time to figure it out.
It does feel to me, though, like when voters voted for it, they thought it was self-implementing, that it wasn't going to take any more lawmaker action.
But I want to echo what Michelle said. Governor-elect DeSantis doesn't owe the Democrats anything, but because his base was so narrow, because he'd really been a D.C. creature, he's reaching out to people like Shane Strum, who was a Charlotte Crist guy. So he is saying, okay, the past is the past and moving forward. So that is a good sign.
Yeah.
Well, as we mentioned earlier on in the show, the FBI probe indicted 2 Tallahassee city officials. Andrew Gillum not mentioned in that indictment. Obviously, the investigation still continues. But did the cloud of this investigation and the $7 million that the GOP spent on making him seem a part of it, did that cost him the election? Is he vindicated now that he wasn't a part of this?
Well, he's certainly not vindicated now. This is just the beginning of the investigation. And I think at the very best for him is, as in Hogan's Heroes, Major Hofstadter used to ask Colonel Klink, is it complicity or stupidity? These were his closest friends and allies. If he wasn't criminally involved, then he was criminally stupid. And we really need to say he was a mayor of a weak city. He was a weak mayor of a medium-sized city. And he let all this happen when he's trying to claim leadership. I think it's a real problem for Gillum going forward.
And I think it's also important to note that the report did not vindicate Andrew Gillum. He is not in the clear. So while his closest allies have been indicted as a result of this investigation, he has not been cleared. So I think the cloud remains for Andrew Gillum.
Did it cost him the election?
I think it was a factor. There's never a silver bullet, but it was one of the factors. I think what cost him the election were 2 things. One, race did not cost him the election, but as people found out how liberal he was or progressive, and the FBI investigation that combined is what drove him down. Plus the fact that 18% of African-American women voted for Ron DeSantis because of school choice, which is a real issue the Democratic Party's going to have to deal with.
Yeah, school choice definitely something that's going to come up because it was a very weak point for them. NBC News reported this week that Andrew Gillum called Beto O'Rourke, reached out to him. He was also a speaker at a top fundraiser for DNC donors in Washington, D.C. Do you see him as a 2020 candidate or maybe a running mate to someone like Beto?
I don't. I think that he's the flavor of the month. He was just the nominee in a mega state. We're the 3rd largest state. But was the weak mayor of a medium-sized city who, at the very best, is going to look like that was incompetently run under his tutelage as mayor. So I think that you're going to find that his career is not going to go very well.
Peter out over the next 2 years. What about you, Michelle?
I think any of the names we're tossing around now as potential nominees for President of the United States is premature. You know, if you asked Floridians if Donald Trump would have been the Republican nominee, we all would have told you no, it was going to be Jeb Bush. I mean, we were in fundraisers and everyone was certain that his path to the nomination was clear. So while these people are the flavor of the month right now, they're not really going to be serious candidates. We don't even know what the landscape's going to look like. And if it would be a mistake to put Andrew Gillum up, he couldn't carry Florida in the governor's race. A Democrat's not going to win the presidency without Florida.
Right.
That's a good point. All right. We'll be right back, folks, with more. Welcome back. I'm joined by Michelle Todd Schorsch and Barry Edwards, 2 Florida political consultants. This week, St. Pete City Council voted to ban plastic straws at most city businesses and polystyrene containers, better known as styrofoam, on city property and rights of way. The ban takes effect in January. Restaurants and bars can only provide plastic straws by request. There are exceptions for drive-thrus or for medical reasons. There's some others as well. Code enforcement says it will only get involved when there is a complaint. First offense is a warning, then fines of up to $80 per day for continuing to go against this policy. Is this smart environmental policy or government overreach? And you are 2 St. Pete City residents.
It's government overreach. It's outside of the scope of what a city government should be doing. They should be focusing more on the city issues that matter to our residents. I don't need a nanny state. I don't need someone to tell me that I shouldn't have a plastic straw because it might end up in the ocean. They're putting an undue burden on families with people with disabilities and with young children.
There are exceptions for those.
There are exceptions, but you have to know that there are exceptions. You have to be prepared to argue it. A lot of restaurants don't know that there are exceptions, and they're just going to implement a straight-out ban. I think it's okay, the movement, to go to straws by request only, but banning straws and styrofoam is just a step too far.
That's an interesting point.
Well, I think my mother's 92. She had her, actually today is her birthday, so happy birthday, Mom.
There you go.
But being 92, she can't drink a soda anymore without a straw. So you have to have exceptions. So I wouldn't classify her as disabled. She's just older.
Sure.
So there are people that need straws. I think that it's well-intentioned, but this is why the state legislature has done a lot of preemption in the past, like with the plastic bags down in Miami Beach. And I would expect the legislature under these Republican leadership under Chris Sprawls and Speaker Oliva to be prone to want to do some other preemption so the cities can't do this. It's a smart environmental policy, but we need it throughout the whole state, not just in little pockets if it's going to be effective.
Okay, fair enough. This week, the Parkland Commission wrapped up its monthly meetings. Part of its recommendations are to arm teachers at schools. The argument from pro-gun supporters is that more guns in the hands of good guys will stop these types of incidents. People on the other side say these are teachers, not officers. I had just had one tweet me just a few moments ago, and that if you had a good guy with a gun already there at Parkland and he did nothing. So is this a good idea? Why isn't the answer, for example, putting more officers on campus?
Well, it's a complicated idea, but the reason why you can't put more officers on campuses is we don't have more officers on campuses. We've had to go from deputy sheriffs to deputy police, or whatever a police officer is called, to private security now because there's just not enough trained officers out there. So that's number one.
But isn't that just a function of supply and demand? This is capitalism. Pay them more money, then there'll be more people.
Well,
but where are we going to get the money from to pay them?
Well, I mean, if we want to live in a society that has guns everywhere, don't we have to protect our children?
Well, that's number one. Number two is, I think what Michelle brought up, is you can put 50 armed school personnel for the cost of one officer, according to Grady Judd. So, but also, I went to Lakewood High. You went to...
I went to Plant in South Tampa.
Okay, those are big campuses. Yeah. You don't need one, you need 3 or 4 because the whole shooting time may only take 4 or 5 minutes. Right. And by the time I'm on the other side of the campus, if I'm the school resource officer, the shooting's over with.
6 minutes, if I remember correctly, the Parkland shooting lasted.
Okay, so, and they're not, and Sheriff Galtieri, who's a great sheriff, and he's actually changed my mind on this. I opposed this vociferously on the radio last year, but what he's saying is not anybody gets a gun, is if you have a background like in the military or former police officer or current police officer or some sort of law enforcement background and you feel comfortable with it, then you go through a psych evaluation and a criminal background check, and then you have to go through 200 hours of training. Right. So we're not saying every school personnel. They go through a lot of rigor, and then you'd have the weapon there so that if there's an incident, they could react quicker. So I think it's complicated, but probably moving in the right direction.
Michelle?
I disagree with Barry. I don't think putting guns in the classroom is the solution. Teachers are already overworked and overstressed and not given the tools they need. And I don't think it's a good idea to have a gun in the classroom environment. Our children are our most precious resource, and yes, we have to protect them, but I don't need a teacher worried about keeping their gun safe so a child doesn't get it and actually accidentally shoot another child. I need the teacher worried about teaching my child how to read and write and do math. I think that we do get more officers, and there are other ways we can harden our schools, but I think arming teachers is a mistake. And if people want to argue that, well, if people with background in law enforcement are who we're going to give the guns to, how many people with backgrounds in law enforcement are teaching in our schools? I can tell you that there's none at my daughter's school. So I don't know who I would, and I love those teachers at my daughter's school. Right. I trust them with her life. Do I want them to have a gun around her? No.
Shows you how complicated it is, but also, if we'd spent $25 to $50 million on mental health treatment. Before the Parkland shooting, we could have saved ourselves $500 million. So I think all these arguments are tangential. Why don't we do the right thing and help people with mental health issues before there's a problem?
That's only part of the big solution that we need. Sorry to cut you off there, but we're running out of time. Thank you both so much. Really appreciate you joining us. We'll be right back.
Thanks for having me.